Have you here. My name is Earl. I'm one of the pastors here at 360, and we hope whether you're joining us in person or online that today means more to you than you thought it might, and it'll be a good day for you. When I first met Janet, I knew immediately that I was in love with her and that she was the one I wanted to marry. That is a bad plan. Now, she wanted nothing to do with me for many months. Long, torturous, painful months. Complete distance, no, for all these elaborate reasons that there's no reason to get into today. And yet here we are 36 years later, having been married that time, and what the Janet planet taught me was that a lot of things that turn out okay don't start so well. And the fact that something has a rough takeoff doesn't mean the landing will be a crash, necessarily. Today we're going to look at something that happened in the ancient world. It didn't start out very well, but it turned out okay because a lot of people were willing to help. It begins as a famine, which is not a good thing. And it arrives in the Palestinian area of the Mediterranean basin in about the mid-40s AD. And it's caused by bad weather, as you would guess, and its effects are amplified by a lot of other things that the people who lived in that region didn't have any control over, like being occupied by the Roman dictators who had just doubled the taxes. Thank you very much. And by overpopulation. And when all of these things lined up, that world being what it is, with no social support services, no bailout programs or anything like that, the region teetered on the brink of malnutrition and starvation. It was devastating, and the reality of it is confirmed in one ancient historian after another. What really made things worse was that this region, especially the city of Jerusalem, was a favorite among Jews who lived in the Roman Empire in the Mediterranean basin to use as a place to retire, which means when the famine hit, there was a massive population of sick old people who needed to be taken care of, with more arriving every day. The famine was compounded by the Christians having taken place just a few years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. You know, their faith didn't insulate them from the effects of what was going on in history, any more than faith in Jesus today insulates you from the Great Recession. Walking with Jesus isn't a warranty or an insurance policy, it's a reality. And so their reality was, we're trusting in Jesus, we understand him as God's son, coming from Jewish backgrounds, they understood him as Messiah, and yet we're all about to starve to death. Now that was accentuated by the fact that following Jesus, they're now responsible for things like hospitality. When people come to visit, they have to pay to put them up and to feed them and house them. Following Jesus, they're now responsible for the care of widows and orphans, and for taking care of people who lose their jobs, of which there were many, because they had adopted this new faith and so were shunned by the families from which they would come. And so that drains resources. Following Jesus, they're responsible to send people out to bring the good news to the rest of the Roman Empire. That's expensive. All of that works well, like getting a dicey mortgage to buy a $3 million house that's really worth $2 million just before the crash did, when all you needed to get that mortgage was your signature and the smile on your beautiful face. And all that came together for people, and they ended up with all this inflated wealth, and it collapsed when the crash hit. And that's kind of what happened here. They were completely drained. And in fact, the early Christians felt that the way to finance things was to bring all of their assets to the church, cash them out, and let the apostles decide who needed help and who didn't. There's some scholarly opinion that once that was done one time, there were no more assets. And so when the famine hit, they couldn't pay for anything anymore, and it could actually be that led to the discontinuation of the practice, and not the fact that people are less generous since the first century. Once you turn in all your capital, there's no way to get another enterprise started, and so the famine hits, and you just have nowhere to turn. The Romans aren't going to help you. All they care about is paying your taxes on time and sending your son into their army. Their legions were stocked with people who had been pulled out of the ranks of the Palestinians, some of which ended up in the legions that invaded Britain and resulted, of course, in the great historical development of all those Roman army movies that came out 2 years ago. All that came together. The famine is a really terrible thing, and God's people are caught up in it. This month we're going to talk about what we call some of the best practices of the faith. Over a lot of years, we started to ask ourselves the question, what are the common traits of people who get it right for a long time? What are the common traits of people who have lives of enduring fruitfulness? And maybe most importantly, what are the common traits of people who have a life that's worth emulating? You know, if you want to do a quick oil dipstick test of where your spiritual life is, you can ask yourself a simple question. What is there in me that someone else should copy? Because biological life and spiritual life have a common feature. Both are made for reproduction. And what is in us that God has put there can almost always be emulated in some way. And what's in us that has come from some other source, maybe a little bit less so. And so as we've thought through this, it seemed to us that the people who stand out over time, one of the traits that they have is that they are generous. And not simply financially, but they just have a generous heart and spirit across the board. I thought a lot this week about what is it about generous people that makes them just pop out of the crowd. A lot of people who give a lot of money to things aren't really generous. They just have a lot of money, so it doesn't hurt them to give it away. You know, what's the big deal? But there are people who have very little, but they're just givers down in their heart, and their time and income and ideas and love and support and encouragement. And I can't prove this either from the Bible or social science, but it seems to me that people who have this generosity are content. And in a world like the one we live in the East Bay, a content person, it's like trying to find a primary color at Banana Republic. You know, it's just not going to happen. You just don't find it. When I walk into a coffee shop in Berkeley, what I feel is the adrenaline level is like at the ceiling, and it's accentuated by the caffeine level, and there's hand wringing and urgent cell phone calls here are always so urgent and loud, and everyone sees their future hanging by a thread. It has to raise the venture capital to do the pitch to the VC guy and get that and leverage this and that, and then use my dad's MasterCard. We'll create the thing that will succeed Apple Computer, and you know, will be the next big thing, because that's what we do here at the East Bay. We do next. Whatever the next thing is, it's going to come from here. And you know, that's a wonderful thing, and actually that's why we came here, because we really like the people that work on Next. We think they're very compelling and interesting. But the downside of it is there's a lot to worry about, because Next is not for sure. Next is just a possibility. You know, it's a kind of Schrodinger's cat thing where it might be alive, might be dead, I don't know. And so that creates a lot of discontent. There's a lot to feel unhappy about here. And a person who gives says, I'm going to be happy anyway. The generous person says, I have something bigger in my life than what's next. And from that platform, I don't have to be a taker. I can be a giver. This famine issue and the concept of generosity is really addressed a lot in the second letter of Paul to the Corinthians. He actually wrote several letters. This is the second one that we have, especially in chapters 8 and 9. The passage I'll be looking at this morning for a few minutes is on the program that you received, and also will appear here on the screen. It begins at verse 6. It says, the point is this. Isn't that a wonderful thing when somebody just gets right to it? Wow, think of that. The sermons could be like 4 minutes long. We've actually thought of doing something called Speed Church, where we would open up, you would come in, the band would do half of a song, then I would do a 2-minute sermon, we'd pray for you for 30 seconds, and send you out the door and bring in the next bunch, like speed dating. Or set it up so you could move through the stations, like 5 minutes with the band, 5 minutes with the sermon, 5 minutes to give, or Skype a missionary or something like that, and send you out. So when I read this is so arresting to me. It just grabbed me. You can't just say the point. It would take an hour. I mean, so this is the point. I've had too much coffee this morning, I'm sorry. Whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. Now there's an agricultural metaphor that has no meaning to you and me whatsoever.
Yeah.
But in the ancient world, this metaphor is as close to their hearts as real estate is to ours. The person who builds a little house will not have a large house to live in. And whoever sows bountifully will reap bountifully. Each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. In other words, you'd never use force or power on people to get them to provide the resources that you need. There's no objective worthy enough that it justifies the use of force. Doesn't that just make you want to go, it kind of just makes you relax, because what God is looking for is not a checkbook or account balance. God's looking for a state of heart, which Paul describes as cheerful. In other words, something that is done joyfully, and generous people have that kind of cheerfulness in the opportunity to contribute, whatever it is, whether it's finances or whatever. Interestingly enough, the word money is never used in this passage. And God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that having all sufficiency, the term there actually means having contentment, in all things, at all times, you may abound in every good work, as it is written. And here's sort of a cobbling together of Isaiah and Hosea from the Old Testament. He has distributed freely, he has given to the poor, his righteousness endures forever. That's a powerful statement. All things, all times. It's very absolute. There's no promise being made here that a generous person will necessarily acquire material wealth, but there's something deeper and more profound that cuts across all the dimensions of the person's life, that has, first of all, to do with being a content person. Imagine sitting in that coffee shop with your caffeine and adrenaline level right to the firewall and still feeling good about life. Verse 10 says, he who supplies seeds to the sower, meaning God, and bread for food, will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. Now the agricultural metaphor starts to make more and more sense when you keep famine running in the back of your mind. Because what the people in need in Palestine, especially in Jerusalem, are facing is an agricultural failure. So when Paul writes to the Corinthians, in their context, he's connecting all the dots with the people that he wants them to help. You'll be enriched in every way, to be generous in every way, which through us will produce thanksgiving to God. So that the ultimate outcome of our generosity is not a change in the financial welfare of any person. That's simply a means to an end. The end is that God be praised, that God be worshipped. I'll tell you what, the day Dannon and I were out of food years ago in another state, and people from our home group pulled up with a station wagon loaded with groceries, including the brand and type of peanut butter that they knew I preferred above all others. Would you believe it? I said, praise the Lord. I said, hallelujah. I said all that stuff. I don't even know what else I might have done, but I had a religious experience there with the peanut butter. Because when someone meets your need, don't you see the hand of God's goodness extended to you in such a personal and direct way? Yeah. It fills you up with praise the way air fills up a balloon. You just let it out and say, God, you're so good. You cared about me so much. You remembered crunchy peanut butter. How could nobody does that for you except somebody that knows you and really loves you well. That's the goal. Everything else along the way is just the means, and the means are also wonderful because people's needs are met. And then in verse 12, for the ministry of this service is not only supplying the needs of the saints, but is also overflowing in many thanksgivings to God. So meeting the needs is the means, overflowing thanksgiving, that's the end. So if God is being praised, it's authentic generosity that's happening. If you subtract the worship and praise and honor to God from it, I'm not sure what it is. But it's not optimal in terms of the words that are given to us in this passage that Paul's inspired to write. Verse 13 says, by their approval of this service, they will glorify God because of your submission that comes from your confession of the gospel of Christ and the generosity of your contribution for them and for all the others, while they long for you and pray for you because of the surpassing grace of God upon you. Thanks be to God for his inexpressible gift. Jesus is that inexpressible gift from the Father to us, and because the Corinthians had confessed that gospel, the original word there refers to a contract. In other words, a real heartfelt commitment to the good news about the person of Jesus Christ. And from that, they reach out to help the people who are starving in Palestine, who when they receive that are going to say the same kinds of things that I said when I got the crunchy peanut butter. God is going to be praised and the needs of people are going to be met. The Corinthians were actually the first church to volunteer to help the people who are being impacted by the famine. Now the truth is we like to beat up on this church because the city was the Las Vegas of the ancient world. And when you read the first letter, they have so many problems. I mean, like Jerry Springer wouldn't have these people on. So sometimes when people say, how can we have all these problems in the church? How can this go wrong? How can that go wrong? Well, just read this. It'll comfort you. It really will. You know, things are never half as bad as they were with this particular group. And so we kind of stereotype them as the bad boys of the New Testament, and we like to use them as the whipping boys when we're looking for someone who's doing wrong. And yet here they are, when somebody's actually in need, they're the first ones to step up. And they went to Paul and said, well, how should we raise this money? And he said, what you need to do is every week have people bring in a contribution and make it proportional to whatever their income is. And we'll collect it, and when I show up on my next visit, we'll round it all up. And they started and they stopped. And they started and they stopped. They had a lot of problems. They were easily distracted. Like a small dog who is running off all the time. That's this church. All we like sheep have gone astray. And they just got, you know how it is with resources. You just think about other things and you forget. And so he visits them. He's getting ready now for his third visit to them. This is the big one. He's going to collect the money, and they're going to physically bring it back to Jerusalem. And so in the run-up to our text this morning, he tells them, look, a delegation is coming in advance, composed of Titus, one of my right-hand people, whom I've appointed, and 2 other delegates appointed by the churches in the area. So we've got good accountability. They're all Gentiles. We're collecting money to go back to Jerusalem to give it to Jewish Christians. And this delegation is going to arrive to make sure that the contributions are all in hand when I show up to make the final collection and physically get the stuff back to Jerusalem. And the reason he gives them in chapter 8 and early chapter 9 is, first, I don't want you to be embarrassed when I show up and you don't have the money, because that's really bad. And secondly, I want to make sure that the contribution is out of a cheerful heart and willingness, and not because I'm there. Because that's close to using power on you. And I don't want you, this is so lovely, I don't want you feeling like, oh, at the last minute we have to rush the funding together because now the big guy is here. And I want you to be willing to do it without me. And so he's writing to them, preparing the way. And what's ironic is, not only are the Corinthians not wealthy, and not only are they from an individualistic, competitive culture, but the people who are part of this delegation, those 3 people, are actually the ones bringing them this letter and are reading it out loud in their presence. Yes, well, we're here to, they must have come across like a call from accounts receivable at MasterCard. And they're standing there in front of the whole Corinthian church, probably reading this out loud, since most of them were likely illiterate. And we're here, and we need you to contribute bazillions of dollars to help the people back in Jerusalem, and they have this opportunity to do this. You know, there's amazing scientific research that goes on at our university here, which we're proud of, and we read about a lot in the newspaper. And science is forging ahead on all these different fronts: nanotechnology, cryogenics, superconductivity. These are just the words that I hear from friends, and then they define them for me. And we're looking for ways to understand the world, ways to understand the universe, and maybe, one day in the far off future, a way to explain the universe in one equation. Maybe, maybe, maybe. Now that could be 10 generations out, but maybe we'll get there. Maybe E equals MC squared is sort of suggestive of what might be possible in that regard. The theory of everything, a unified field theory, we could tie everything together. I mean, it could, well, I felt to announce this morning that we don't need to conduct any of that research anymore, because I have discovered the theory of everything, the iron law of the universe, the one principle which is responsible for all other principles, the idea which rules all the other ideas, and it is this: you can do what you can pay for. Let's all say that together. You can do what you can pay for. One more time. You can do what you can pay for. Now, once like you mean it, you can do what you can pay for. If you can pay for it, you're a genius. What's the difference between a smart guy and a genius? About $250,000. It's like the difference between a regular tomato and an organic tomato. It's, $2. It's the same basic idea. If you have capital, you can do anything that you can pay for. And what Paul's telling these guys is, we can totally do this. Yeah. We just have to be able to pay for it. That's the main thing. And so our church is here because we feel like we need something, we have something to do in this community. We feel like the famine is not so much an agricultural thing, but the famine is for expression of the good news about Jesus in our community, and we need to do something about that. Here's how things work at 360 Church. Our 3 stands for 3 commitments. We have a commitment to our Creator, we have a commitment to creative people, those are the next folks, and we have a commitment to connecting those 2. The 6 stands for the other 6 days of the week, because Sunday is easy if you can pay for it. And the 0 stands for 0 regrets. We think in a life of faith you should be able to live without regrets. And we put those 3 things together. And here is what we're doing in Berkeley. I think people are hungry in the world because we've got too many smart folks figuring out how to come up with better flavors of dog food. At our core, we are what you might call a social justice church. Now, not in the conventional sense, but our core concept is this: if the people who do next fall under the influence of the mind of Christ through faith in God's Son Jesus, they're going to have inspiration and ideas and empowerment that is going to send them into areas that will result in them helping people who desperately need it, rather than being involved in other things quite as much that may not be so significant to people who are suffering the real famines in the world. Now, I have nothing against dogs, and I think dog food should be delicious. But with people starving and dying, and with people not knowing about God's inexpressible gift given to us in the form of His Son Jesus, if we're going to do anything in this planet, the next people have to stand up and do it.
That's right.
They have to stand up and do it. They have to create the entities, the nonprofits, the great businesses, the new universities, the scientific breakthroughs. I know that Alzheimer's research is done here at Cal. I'm so glad for that. My dad died of Alzheimer's. I think about that constantly. And all of the other conditions that all of our personal histories represent, and what a difference could be made in the world. But to make that difference, we have to pay for it. I'm so proud of you guys for our 2nd month of making our rent payment out of cash flow. We're right on our plan in terms of using savings to get to a certain point, and now we're making the transition out of cash flow. And so paying the rent on this place, which is the vast lion's share of our budget, for 2 months in a row out of cash flow, it's like at the end of school moving out of your mom and dad's basement and getting your first apartment. It's like, I'm for real now. I can own a microwave oven and pay for it myself. That's how it feels for us. We're so thankful for that. And you know where that comes from? That comes from generosity. That comes from cheerful giving. That doesn't come from us having a secret millionaire stashed away from someplace who does that for us. We're not that kind of group. You guys did that just by helping us and honoring us. Now people sometimes say, well, is tithing the standard? In other words, is giving 10% of your income Is that the standard that we need to use to be able to put generosity in an institutional form? The way I read it, I am very slow to take Old Testament laws, pick one, and just apply it when we're not stoning rebellious teenagers. You see where I'm going with that? I'm very, very, very slow to just lift one thing out because it's in the financial self-interest of our church, and impose it as a standard and take the cheerfulness out of it. I will say this, if you're just exploring the concept of financial generosity, tithing is a great place to start though, because it does meet all of the criteria. It can be cheerful, it comes from a decision, it's regular, it's every Sunday, so it's a great fit for the biblical principles. And having practiced it for longer than most of you have been alive, I will say this, it does not disappoint. It does not disappoint. It's a happy thing. It's a happy thing. When you have nothing, when you have $1 and you put that dime into the offering and your small group shows up with the crunchy peanut butter, that's when you say, yes, this is not about what I give, this is about what's in my heart. The standard is generosity. And honestly, the reason that we don't make a demand about tithing is it's not generous enough. It's not enough. I don't mean to laugh. It makes me happy being being free from all of that, and yet at the same time saying that what we're doing needs doing. It's worthwhile. If you believe that, help us pay for it. Help us pay for it. Step up and be an investor. Be an investor in what's happening here. I believe we can change the world from this little second floor spot in Berkeley and wherever we'll be next. Help us pay for it, and we can change the world. I have a visual aid this morning. This is a check for $1 million. Now it's a PDF copy. We tried to get it by the bank and they wouldn't take it. I don't know why. Not really. This check is from Plum Creek Community Church, which is located near Denver, Colorado. And this was given to me by a friend of mine who is the pastor at that church. The church has been open for 5 years. And they, this year, wrote this check to buy an old bowling alley to convert into their new facility and worship space and offices. And when I heard this story and saw my friend produce this check, I asked him to give me a copy of it because I wanted to show it to you. That's $1 million. And these folks put their pants on one leg at a time. Does anybody say that anymore? They're just like us. And they're 5 years in. We're 10 months in. So that makes us, what, about $200,000 is what we can do right now. That's a check for $1 million. But I'll tell you this, from a generous spirit, if you're content in your heart, a great cup of Pete's coffee, that's $1 million. And when Jen puts her arms around me, gives me a kiss, that's $1 million. And when I greet a visitor and I feel so glad that they're here to be with us, that's $1 million. And when I hang with you guys and we drink coffee and eat Trader Joe's cookies, or we're watching Independence Day together, or Iron Man, that's $1 million to me.
Yeah. That's right.
Generous people, they know what $1 million really is.
That's right.
I'm going to ask our band to come and lead us in worship for just a moment. And today, we thought we would, talking on generosity, we would take our offering at the end of our service. And we'll do that in a little bit of a different way. We'll give you just a moment if you're a paper person and you need to do a check. If you're electronic, we can help you that way too. We're going to have the band just begin to play and just lead us in worship. And we wanted to today to just connect generosity with worship and with thanksgiving in a physical way by being able to give while that worship was going on. And so what we'll do is we'll have some of our leaders bring one of our little blue offering bags to both of the black tables here on the left and right. You can use those if you use check or cash. We also have an electronic giving station, a swipe station if you do a card, back in the lounge area there on the cafe table. And the idea here is simply to, you've got a chance to just grow our hearts on this issue to make us more generous. Now, I have been in so many church services dead broke. I mean, we have been poor. I mean, go to the lake and catch fish for protein, poor in our lives. Poor. You may have a penny or a dime. You may have to take a communication card and on the back write, I really like Jesus, or whatever. But even if that's all it is, this is not about amounts. It's about what you feel in your heart, and it's about being able to bring our gifts to God as a tangible act of worship, saying, God, I believe in what you're doing here, and even if it's just a, I'm with you in this, God, note written on the back of the communication card, if all I can invest this morning is my faith, I'll invest that, and I'll do it with generosity. Would you stand with me?